Hey everyone, it is Wednesday morning, and that means we speak with Anna Kelly. How you doing, Anna?
I'm great this morning. How about you, Michael?
I'm doing very well. You put out a very interesting set of posts on your personal Facebook page yesterday, really talking about a coordinated global financial plan by organizations typically outside of the United States ecosystem, IMF, FSB, all of that. And I really read some of the documents that you were nice enough to attach. And what I left myself was, I got to talk with Anna today because I looked at that going, what can real estate investors do? So I think we need to step back. We need to catch people up because they haven't read your post. They probably haven't read the public documents. But let's talk about what you've collected and then really answer the question, what could this mean to real estate investors? What do you think?
Sure, I'll do my best. Kind of high level, one of the things we've talked about a lot over time, especially through COVID, is trying to figure out what is going on and what is next, and trying to just put our heads around why is the Fed taking certain types of actions that seem ill-advised and seem that it could lead to worse pain. And then they cause pain, and then they have to come in with a stopgap to fix it.
Yeah.
So, for example, we had a sudden forbearances. Everybody can stop making mortgage payments. You don't really have to justify it. You just have to say you're impacted. And so, well, what happens to all the servicers that still have to pay the investors on the back end?
Right.
And suddenly, these servicers were within days of going bankrupt because they said, we can't pay our investors if we don't have money coming in and collect payments.
Makes sense.
And then the Fed said, we're not really going to give you a liquidity facility, but maybe we'll, have a big shark buy the small shark. And then they started buying mortgage-backed securities in droves, which tanked the prices, which caused these servicers and these lenders who had hedged their bets of interest rate risk, and interest rates changing from the time you lock to the time you close. Yep. And all of a sudden they had to come up with payments for these bad bets.
I remember.
And what the government did was about to bankrupt servicers. And I thought, how did they not know that this was going to happen? And that if they institute forbearances, you've got to think about how does it impact your servicers, MBS, and then all the hedge funds and mutual funds and pension plans we invest in that hold those mortgage-backed securities. So things like that, Michael. The next thing that made me go, what's going on here, was if you have a federally backed mortgage, no evictions. And I thought, well, why not no evictions for people that were laid off that aren't getting unemployment? So we're giving all these people $2,400 a month extra on top of unemployment, where a significant portion of the workforce now is making more to stay unemployed than they are to go back to work. But yet they're trying to say that nobody has to pay rent. And it's making it very difficult for investors to go, how are we going to cover all of our expenses?
Yep.
And then the third thing that I saw that made me go, wait a second, something's not right here, was proposed legislation from Omar and what's known as the squad, the lady, far left, that came in that said, hey, we're going to do rent forgiveness. And if landlords need help paying bills, we'll just lend you money, but you've got to agree to give health insurance to your tenants. You've got to agree to give them 10% of your profits. You can't discriminate for any reason. And if you violate any of these rules, we can take your property. And we talked about this a few weeks ago and went, what is happening? Well, that'll never happen in our country because that's just the far left, the fringe. Yeah. These things will never happen. So as I'm trying to think through as an investor, Michael, where is our economy headed? What happens if there's a change in executive branch leadership, the presidency? What happens if there's not? And what's going to happen economically, fiscally, and to me as a landlord investor?
Absolutely.
Putting aside all of the politics of what we think about what's going on in the world, regardless of how we are bent, left or right, and regardless of our own fears for our family businesses, as real estate investors, because that's the primary way that we bring in income for our family.
For sure.
I have to think what's coming, how can I try to mitigate the risks that are ahead, and to compassionately care for the people in my communities, but also make sure that I'm making wise financial decisions so that I'm buying the right types of properties. So we've got this new era of legislative risk and unknown risks that we just don't know the answer to. And so I just was like, there's something more than this. And I will tell you, before I start to share why I started thinking about these things, I saw one post from Robert Kiyosaki, that he was kind of like warning, things are happening. There's other forces outside of America controlling these things. And I'm like, I didn't listen, to anything else he said. I have family members and friends who are like, on one extreme, everything that doesn't fit the media narrative is fake news and conspiracy theory.
Right.
And then I have friends and family on the other side that are like, everything's a conspiracy. It's the Rothschilds, it's the aliens, it's the British, leadership, and they're all destroying the world, and they're going to destroy the world. And this is all a big global conspiracy. So I know that somewhere in the middle of that, there's things that tell us there's some truth that both sides kind of cling to, but there's something bigger going on. So
okay.
I had studied the United Nations Agenda 21, from years ago, 80s and 90s, and maybe even before then. And then I had started studying the UN Millennial Goals about 2001, 2002, because the United Nations was coordinating with all of its member countries, including the United States, to try to reach some global goals, things in and of themselves that aren't bad. Wiping out poverty, bringing about more sustainable development, bringing education to everyone, wiping out disease, and wealth equality. Wealth equality is the one that's always had us as Americans go, wait a second, there's a fairness factor here. We care about people and we want to help those in poverty, but we don't want the governments to steal from those that are deemed the evil rich to give everything that they've worked so hard for to poor people, or put too many programs out there that make people dependent on the government. So there's been a big divide between Republicans and Democrats for years on, how much taxation is too much, how much should you take from the rich to give to the poor. And so we have this battle of discussion and ideology in America and in other countries, capitalism versus socialism, which one is more genuine, which one is more noble and moral. And you'll have arguments on both sides of that. Okay. Well, I knew, going back to the United Nations, that they've been talking about these things and trying to get the global community to move more and more and more close to these main goals. Well, they created something called the Sustainable Development Goals. And when I started to think about globalism, and I said, you know what, I know that we're coordinating with the WHO, and the global community, as we say, is trying to make sure that all countries have medical knowledge, and that we try to have some kind of coordination where we stop the spread of the disease, talking about canceling flights and closed borders and things like that. But yet one of their goals is open borders and allowing immigration in every country freely with no rules, no restrictions, which very much goes against what America has always said, closed borders, we support our own, we tax our own, they get their services first. So I knew that some of these rules have been in place, but what surprised me is I said, if they're coordinating on a health perspective, I wonder if they're doing anything coordinated from a financial and economic perspective.
Yeah.
Knowing that some of their goals have always been wealth equality. And I've read books from people with, everyone has political bias, whether they think so or not, but I've read economic books from different people that say America is going to, have to give up more and give more toward the global community. I knew that the UN had talked about a global tax to promote climate change, years ago, back in 2001 or 2, when I was looking at this. And so I just started seeing some of these things and saying, some of these things are happening in multiple countries, giving everybody mass amounts of money. And then thinking, why are we pumping so much money into the system instead of targeting it to the people that really need it? Such as, you've been laid off, you get checks. Right. Why did I get checks for my family when I made a lot of money last year? I just happened to have depreciation that made me look like a loss. But families that really need it, that were undocumented or that worked under the table, didn't get it.
Yep.
So I asked myself those questions. Why isn't it more targeted? And what's going to happen when we're putting so much into the economy, cash, loans, basically wiping out reserve requirements that were so important and put in place after 2008 for all these
Yeah.
banks.
Yep.
They're just saying, we'll give you however much money, you keep lending to everybody, every person, every business. It doesn't matter what their debt to income ratio is. That came out again today.
I saw that.
Let's wipe out the debt to income requirements and let's just start giving everybody money, because they're trying to prop up the economy and keep us from going into a depression or deflationary spiral by giving everybody money and telling them to keep spending. But what you have to ask yourself is, what's going to happen with inflation? Is that going to cause mass inflation with mass debt, both personally, corporately, municipality level, because taxation is going to be a problem for people that can't work, at the state and then the federal level? So all these questions, Michael, are what precipitated me to go, I want to do a little more research and see if the UN has anything to do with the financial things that are happening.
Yep.
And sure enough, I pulled up United Nations documents and I saw that the FSB, which is a financial stability board, International Financial Stability Board, basically had a document that says, here's the coordinated efforts that we need to do in response to COVID, but also to expedite the funding of the UN 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. So I thought, wait a second, what does sustainable development and climate change have to do with COVID-19?
Yep.
And why are we trying to expedite all of these goals for the UN when our first crisis should be, let's take care of, our country, the COVID disease, and then the businesses that are faltering because they're closed down.
Yep.
And I was really, quite frankly, shocked, even though I understand that there's globalism. I understand that there's been a UN and these goals for a long time. I was shocked to see a document on the FSB. And this is not conspiracy theory. This is like real, live, active documents of global planning that said, here are the coordinated efforts that all of our member countries are agreeing to make. And it has a list, and the United States is on there, from a fiscal policy, from a monetary policy, to prop up loans, to prop up funding to people that need it. And by and large, all of these things that made me scratch my head, Michael, every single one of them is a coordinated effort that the UN and the FSB has agreed to institute in all of their member countries in order to not only help with COVID, but quickly advance their agenda. And the most alarming piece of the agenda for me as an investor, whether, again, you agree with the goals of the UN or not, is the goal for a level playing field and wealth equality across the world. And part of the UN's agenda, and I've read the actual documents, they're on the UN's website. This is not from any conspiracy theory influence on me, because I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but it quite clearly says we need to level the playing field. We need to create a global tax on all corporations, all employees, and that global tax will start funding all of our goals and create some wealth equality across the entire world. And that richer nations are just going to have to make adjustments so that we are giving more money to the poor, taxing the corporations and people with wealth, so that we can create an equal economic benefit for everybody, regardless of what sector you're in, regardless of whether you're working or not. And in light of those things, it made me go, oh, the reason everybody's getting checks, everybody, not just the people that really need it, is because it incentivizes people to not have to work. It basically immediately institutes a higher minimum wage, a living wage, which on the left, they've been trying to do for a long time, and the right has fought that. But instantly, we now see a huge increased living wage, which is about $48,000 a year for people right now that are on unemployment. And so some of these things, now I'm going, aha, we're doing these things. It doesn't matter that it might hurt the United States for a while. It doesn't matter that there's going to be businesses shut down, corporations shut down, because the goal, the end goal, and we've agreed to it through the UN 2019 to 21 agenda, and through the FSB guidelines, we've agreed to do these things. And it's beyond just what's best for the United States and our current capitalist society and our economics. It's a greater global picture. And that's not to say that it's nefarious, but it's to say that what the government is doing, the Congress, bipartisan, and what we're seeing the Fed doing
Mhm.
is absolutely in coherence and in coordination with the global community.
Wow, lots and lots in that. And again, for folks that haven't read it, they should follow you or become friends with you. I'm assuming it's public so people can share it. I think I've seen people share it. So
Yeah, I made it public so that you can, and I
yeah.
posted the links to the documents. So
Yep.
when you share links, Facebook doesn't take it very far, so they're in the comments, but there's some pictures, and you can
Yep.
go straight to the UN website. You can look at the FSB website and look at it for yourself.
Yeah. So let's take this back to being real estate investors, because again, that's where you and I pay our bills, right? So, God, there's so much to go through. So let's talk about let's just talk about where you ended, right? This living wage, if you will, the $48,000, which is basically the unemployment benefits weekly times 4 times 12. That's how you got to 48K. That is more than many people make that are non-skilled, right? Retail and restaurant owners. That's just a truthful statement.
Right.
And what would happen if that became a living wage and that was kind of like the minimum? There's only one answer, and that is inflation. I mean, that is an
Inflation and more
outcome.
taxes.
And more taxes. And more taxes, correct. And if you look at inflation and more taxes for real estate owners, generally speaking, if you are an existing owner of assets, right, you already owned it pre-inflation, generally speaking, that's a good thing for you, right? Because the value of your asset goes up in general, but also what you and I collect and rent or lease would also go up, right? Would you say that's fair?
Generally speaking, yes.
Generally speaking. Then you go to the other side and go, okay, if that is true, then there's the other branch. Where does taxes go? Now you could
That's
definitely.
why I said generally speaking.
Yeah.
Because what happens with your expenses and your taxes that could change the net income, even if your rents are going up.
We're talking top line first, and then the bottom line in the middle. The variable is going to be tax treatments, which you could certainly see change. And I've already on record saying that in California, which is where I reside, there is a thing that we call Prop 13, which allows basically your real estate value taxes not to go up. It's basically based on purchase price. So if you bought a house in Sunnyvale, like my parents did in the 70s, your property tax bill is nothing. It's like a tank of gas. But if you bought that house next door in 2020, your tax bill is like freaking a new car, right? So I see that as an example of how people can take and tweak tax treatment in real estate and hurt segments of the economy. So again, an owner could be substantially hurt if that were to happen. And that's just one example of what could be coming.
Sure. And I think one of the issues too is when we talk about the fact that so many businesses have been shut down and that corporations are starting to lay off, and they're struggling too, because now they're taking more debt to cover their expenses and their debt, but they still don't have any increase in income and revenue coming in because people are just not spending money, to some extent. So you've got a lower tax base, a lower amount of businesses that are paying taxes,
for sure.
And municipalities are going to start hurting. And then the people that have been laid off aren't going to be able to pay taxes. So our municipalities are putting tons of money and efforts into COVID, the medical response. And then yet they're going, wait a second, we're running out of money. So there's three answers. There's cut services, there's raise taxes, or there's borrow more for the Fed and then still raise taxes to pay it off. So I think locally at any municipality level, at your school district level, and then at a state level for any state that has a state income tax, your taxes are going to start really going up. And if the UN's 2030 Sustainable Development Goals actually go through, we can count on seeing a new global tax for climate change as well. So then there's additional tax on your income. So as an investor, our expenses might go up, our taxes might go up. And even though people are making more money, once they're at 48,000, they're no longer in the lowest tax bracket, I don't think. They're going to have to pay the global tax too.
24 or 28, yeah.
Yeah, so their ability to pay a rising rent just because our costs have gone up still may be stymied a little bit. And so It's all a lot of, conjecture on when,
Mm,
but we can see that these things are going to happen. And I think what it means, Michael, is we've got to think about, where do we invest that
yep.
these things are less likely to happen soon?
Yep.
And that would be more conservative municipalities that don't like to tax. They'd rather cut expenses.
Hmm.
Again, regardless of what you think about the
Oh yeah,
politics,
for sure.
but from just a purely economic standpoint, you invest in those areas. You invest in states where you think they're less likely to, raise taxes, put rent caps, because rent caps is the next thing.
Yep.
If there's inflation and there's high taxes and there's affordability, okay, Mr. Landlord, now you can't raise, raise rents on anybody.
Yep.
So your expenses are going up. You have no way to raise rents, and that immediately decreases the value of your property and
Amen.
decreases your returns. And so I have to start thinking, where can I put my money that the taxes and the expenses aren't going to kill us or our residents,
Yep.
and where they're less likely to put rent caps? That's my first thought.
Hmm. Yeah. So my answer to that is, don't invest in San Francisco, California. That's my first answer to that, because you are in huge trouble. And we're already seeing that rents are coming down, population is shrinking. But yeah,
New York.
yeah, New York, same thing, right? So again, and oh, by the way, that's going to be a cascading effect, right? Because their tax base is being eroded, right? California's already, I think it's 48, might be 58. It had an 8 on it, $1 billion in the hole for 2020, right? Just wait the 2021 when business, oh, it's going to be ugly. Oh my God, California's going
But
to be
then,
ugly.
the next part, just to take that another level, where
Uh-huh.
I said, I think a few episodes ago when we talked about, oh, what if Bernie gets in? And then it's socialism, and then it's
Yeah.
kind of all over for real estate investors.
Yeah.
And then I saw this legislation, proposed as CARES Act 2 from Omar. I think she was the one that co-signed it, co-authored it. I thought this would never happen in our country.
Yeah.
And now I'm saying, wait a second, our UN and our Financial Stability Board have said these are our goals. We are going to take this crisis not only to fix COVID fallout, but to help us to move toward those goals. And the plan, I'll read it. I want to read it because I don't want to misquote it. But the plan basically says, even though our 2030 agenda is for 2030, we expect member countries from 2019, this was published in 2019 in September, I believe, through 2021 to make major headways in transformational financial and economic change in their countries. And so they are taking this crisis to advance the global goals, and now I think, okay, and I'm going to say one thing political. I don't say much. I don't like Donald Trump as a human being. I don't like his character and the way he treats people. But there are certainly, and like Omar coming into power and expediting all of this happening more quickly. And where before we said, that'll never happen, not in our lifetime, or probably at least, it's going to be a while. Now I'm like, there's a very real possibility with all the chaos in the world from every different area that's causing division, that we end up with an administration change in November.
For sure.
And if we do, we know that because the Democratic Party tends to lean more left and in alignment with the UN, that these changes are probably coming sooner than later. And I think we have to at least open our mind to however we feel about it. We have to put our feelings and politics aside and say, let me just look from a purely logical standpoint as a real estate investor that needs to take care of my family, take care of my tenants, and take care of my investors. What is the real implication, whether we keep the current administration or not, on this global agenda, and how might it impact us, and what can we do to diversify, to adjust, and to react? And so, they want rent forgiveness. Our next thing has to be, Michael, rather than just go out and look for opportunity and hope to pounce on my next deal, are we going to have another wave? And is there going to be rent forgiveness that we have to deal with at the end of the year, and back up and give rent forgiveness and give money back to tenants if we're invested in certain states? I hate to say it, but that's a real possibility. And within the UN goals, it specifically talks about rent rent problem, being a big problem, and that people are being forcibly evicted, and we need to deal with that disparity and injustice and talk about rent forgiveness. It's in their documents.
Yeah.
So we have to think about that, Michael, and say, how do we prepare? How much cash do we need if things change? And I don't think any of us really think that that's a possibility until you read these documents, and it opens your eyes to go, wait a second, I need to be a little more educated to what's coming and what's going on and learn how to mitigate that risk.
Yeah, because that's one place I've been playing with. As it should be obvious to everyone, I invest in California. We've already made jokes about California and all the trouble. So I see we already have rent control. We actually voted on rent control last November. The citizens of California said no. Gavin Newsom said after basically, you're an idiot, I'm going to enact it by special powers. So why vote? I mean, that was insane of him, but he did it. So yeah, we have to answer these questions. And that's the thing, right? The stuff coming out of Omar, right? The squad or whatever you want to call them. Most of that, or I shouldn't say most, many of those things that I have read attack the US Constitution, right? There's a part of the Constitution, and I forget which article it was, but basically the federal government can't get in between a signed contract between two parties. That's in the Constitution, right? And we're not talking state constitution. We are talking the Constitution.
Right.
And to think because of some crisis or some global goals, you're going to attack the Constitution, that does not sit well with me. And when did that Constitution become something we don't think about anymore? I just don't get it.
And I think that's a real issue. And, one of the things that I read back when I was looking at the UN Millennial Goals that kind of made me go, wait a second, what in the world? Was that they were talking about climate change being our biggest national crisis and biggest national emergency, and that the planet was going to shrivel up. So regardless of what you think about climate change and how severe it is or how bad it is, I mean, we know that there are some things we need to do to protect our planet, okay, regardless of what extreme on that you are. But in the UN Millennial Goals document, and again, I read it myself, so I'll have to go back and find it because it's been almost a decade ago since I read it. But it said that the two biggest impediments to reaching their goals for sustainability was guns and religion. And so, and it said, so countries that are sovereign countries who have constitutions that allow unlimited religious rights and unlimited gun rights are our biggest impediment. And we have to figure out how to bring society to the place that they recognize that individual rights have to be subjected to communal global rights.
Wow.
And that is the thinking. And so as an American, we are so ingrained that we have these unalienable human rights. They'll never keep us from assembling as believers in a church. They'll never take our guns away. So that if there's ever tyranny or a global takeover of the Constitution or trying to overthrow our country and open it up, people have the right to fight back, and I don't want to get political on, what your thoughts are on whether you should fight back or not. But our founders of our country have always said, unalienable rights include religious and the ability to protect yourself and to overthrow tyrannical governments. It's written in our founding documents. And so when the UN knows that this is our biggest impediment to getting there because people in sovereign nations won't stand for it, it's no wonder that they start to implement things that allow the taking of individual rights to some extent with the excuse that it's for the national good. Right. And so that's an issue that a lot of people are struggling now with, even with COVID. And again, I'm trying to be very careful not to have political bias here, but regardless of whether you think businesses should be shut down and we should have to wear masks, the fact is that some freedoms have been taken away for the greater good of saving people from disease. And people are fighting each other because they feel like this could be the beginning of freedoms being taken away. And the sad thing is, Michael, it has been looked at as our country's individual freedoms being impediment to the greater global good. And so how much Americans fight it or don't fight it now, I think we could see a lot more of this concern and a lot more individual freedom slowly being taken away for, for in the name of the greater good, such
Right.
as your contract rights. Well, I can't evict someone, even though my contract says if you don't pay, I can evict you.
Mm-hmm.
Well, they're taking away my freedom to have a contract. If they say I can't go to church because only 10 people are allowed, technically that's a violation of my religious rights. So our church is meeting outside and we're staying 6 feet apart and we're meeting anyway. But there's all of those little kind of things slowly start to erode what's supposed to be our rights in the Constitution.
Mm-hmm.
And if the FSB and the United States, our Congress, our leaders, whatever branches, are going along with the Sustainable Development Goals, and they're going along with the Financial Stability Board's recommendation for transformational change across all countries, then we have to expect there's more coming and not less.
Yeah.
And that's what gives me some anxiety to think, how do I wisely navigate that these things may happen and that the things I thought never could happen are happening, and we're probably in for more.
Yeah.
It's a little bit of a scary thought, but how do we wisely navigate it? And I'm still trying to figure this out, Michael. I don't have the answers.
Yeah, I don't have the answers.
We need to be aware. We
Yeah.
need to be aware, and we need to be thinking about these things.
Yeah, for sure. And again, I go back to the contract rights being one of those lines in the sand that I never thought would be crossed. And again, to keep it at the real estate investing kind of outcome, if I were to look into my crystal ball, right, before I read your articles, which scare me to death, but before I read my crystal ball, one thing I could say for certain is affordable housing, right? There's going to be more affordable housing. Now you get to argue what more is. Is it 10% more? Is it 100% more? Is it 200% more? There's going to be more. I think that is very likely. And then in my head is that, okay, let's just say it doubles, right? Twice as many people need help, and affordable housing is now a right. How does that happen? Does things like Omar and the squad talking about, where basically the government takes property and says national good, blah, 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 just takes it. And then they become housing owners, right? Possible. That's possible. Or
the legislation to allow that, by the way.
They did, right? But
yes,
it didn't go anywhere. But that is
right.
a possibility. Totally agree.
Mm-hmm.
Hopefully not likely, but it's definitely a possibility.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing that I think is more likely is why don't we take this, what you and I call Section 8, and let's give it a new name. Let's call it whatever. Call it whatever you want. And let's just double the money, right? I could see that happening as well. But then I go, okay, shoot, what happens if that happens, right? I mean, there's so many important things to think about that are going on right now. It is certainly a mess. And then, oh, by the way, since I'm already an existing owner, what does that happen to my current portfolio, good or bad? And then I'm still not done. I want to buy more. How do I make sure my next purchase is not hurt by this? And oh, by the way, what do I have to do with my cash reserves? Because like you said, if we head into the end of the year, there's an executive branch change and suddenly rent forgiveness. I mean, there's a lot of uncertainty today.
And here's another thing that's a little bit scary.
Mm-hmm.
But, we've talked about going to some type of international currency or global currency, there's been talks of it forever, the Bitcoin, all that kind of stuff.
Yep.
But one of the things that I saw that made me go, well, that's interesting, because I actually read the whole CARES Act, because
Right.
As an investor, I wanted to see everything that impacted me.
Mm-hmm.
And as a business owner, my husband, everything that impacted him and my family and my tenants and everybody. And I saw that there was something snuck in there about banks now having to go to be prepared for all digital wallets, basically a cashless society.
Yep.
And so I looked at something it was on the Treasury website or the Fed, and there was, details about this new digital wallet and going to a digital currency. Basically, they didn't say cashless society, but that's basically what it is. And then on the FSB website and in the UN documents, I was like, oh, they're pushing the whole world now to think about equalizing cashless digitized currency so that it's in these documents, they can track all income, prevent tax evasion from the new global tax that will help all of their sustainable development goals.
Oh,
So
how funny. They're doing it because they want their tax money. How creative.
it's in the documents, and because they want to equalize the level playing field of all corporations and all people internationally. And so I have to think, okay, you think your money is safe in a bank and you think your cash might be safe, but the value of the US dollar could go down significantly. We might not have the US dollar. Then the question is, do we buy gold? Do we buy silver? What do we do with it? Will it be worth anything if everything's digital? Like, there's so much transformational change that is being promoted and that we are going along with bipartisanly. How many of our leaders really understand what's coming or don't? I don't know, but there is transformational change coming. So then I asked myself when I read that, what about all my tenants who, and I do have some, who might live in a nice area, but they work under the table for cash. They're waiters, they're waitresses, they're cooks.
Me too.
The tenants that we had that weren't able to pay during COVID were in that category. And so they couldn't even get unemployment benefits. So I have certain tenants that still pay cash and they do not have a bank account. They don't trust the banking system. What's going to happen there? So I think we're moving closer to a cashless society and a more taxed society. And we just have to be prepared for that as well. When we think about where do we stash cash and, for a rainy day or for when these things happen. So just so much information, and it's kind of overwhelming. And I read it, I posted it, I spent several days. Today I'm reading another document on the entire UN coordination of COVID-19. So I'll post that, probably later this week when I get to digest it, but there's a lot to digest. And I just, my whole point of posting all this again, and I don't want to come across like all I care about is the money and I don't care about any of these goals or these people, because I do, my heart cares about people. But I posted them from the standpoint of people need to be aware and understand what's going on because it impacts every single one of us as American citizens. And we need to know what's coming so that we can prepare for it and not just go along like nothing's changing when COVID is eradicated, because the reality is we're not going back to the same US economy that we've always known and loved. We're just not.
Yeah. So as we kind of wrap this up, where would you, if people wanted to read more for themselves, what are the websites? Is it imf.gov? Is it un.gov? What are the sites they should go to?
It's FSB.org.
FSB.org.
Is the Financial Stability Board. And I think UN is un.org. Let me just go pull it up for you. I have to go back to my website.
I will put those in the top of the description.
Yes, let me just confirm that is right. And again, if you go out to my Facebook page, I did make the post public. And in the comments, I have the links to the UN documents. Also, the IMF is coordinating a lot of this, the International Monetary Fund. So yes, it's un.org. And you can just type in Sustainable Development Goals. And you can type in COVID response on FSB. So I have a link to the documents. And that's just a primer for you to start, educating yourself. But it's interesting because a coordinated effort basically says pump tons of money in, make loans unlimited to everybody, every business, every person, and stop put mortgages in forbearances, stop loan payments, stop evictions, think about rent controls. So all these things are in the checklist. It's like column one, the country that's done it. This is the country that still needs to do it. And we've done all but I think 4 as of the end of April or May. So the rest are coming.
Very, very cool. Well, Anna, thank you for doing that. Thank you for keeping us all informed what's going on. And again, we have to ask these questions as real estate investors, what could happen? So I appreciate you.
Sure. Thank you so much.
You got it.